for joining us today for this special author chat with a very fascinating writer. I'm excited to meet you, Daniel. So I was a huge fan of The Boys in the Boat. And so for everybody joining today, this is Daniel James Brown, and his new book is Facing the Mountain. And it is a gripping World War II saga of patriotism and courage. The special Japanese American Army unit that overcame brutal odds in Europe, their families incarcerated back home, and a young man who refused to surrender his constitutional rights, even if it meant imprisonment. And I know a lot of you are probably just in the session that he was on with some other nonfiction writers. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to all of them. Daniel, one question I would like to have you start off with is, I just thought The Boys in the Boat was just fascinating. I loved the way you were so eloquent with taking one man's life story, and in the view of his entire life story, the things you learn about the country and how everybody reacts to different the same circumstances, wildly different. I mean, I remember in The Boys in the Boat the way the stepmother handled crisis as opposed to the rowing team and all that. So when you are doing your research for the stories you're going to tell, how important is it to stick with the personal narratives of the people that you are interviewing for the story, and do you kind of let their narratives tell the bigger story, if that makes sense as a question?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the whole aim of the endeavor is to personalize the story, to personalize the history. So it's the same thing with this new book, Facing the Mountain. I'm not trying to write a comprehensive history of rowing in the 1930s or even of the Olympic rowing program or anything like that. I'm trying to tell a story focused on specific people, introduce my readers to those people, let them get to know those people really well, so that they can empathize with them and understand them, and then put that in historical context, because the history becomes much more interesting and relevant, and I think for everybody, if they feel a connection with the central figures. So, that's always the challenge. It was with The Boys in the Boat, it was made easier by the fact that Joe Rance, the principal character, was my next door neighbor, although he passed away very early on in the writing of the book. And his daughter Judy had kept, copious notes about her father's life. So that helped a lot. In this new book, again, the book is based almost entirely on firsthand accounts. There's a project in Seattle called the Densho Project that Tom Ikeda, the director, has been collecting and videotaping oral histories of Japanese Americans, particularly during the World War II era, and making those available. And so I wound up focusing on 4 individuals, but I spent hours and hours and hours listening to their recorded oral histories over and over, and then B, talking to their families to get to know them really well as individuals. So, yeah, for me, it's all about making it personal.
I think you're fabulous at it, and I think you're right. I think if the more personal you make a story that's bigger and sometimes too big, I think the way that you make it so personal really does make it applicable, and also makes it easier to learn about it. And I remember when I read The Boys in the Boat, and I'm really excited to read your new book, Facing the Mountain. But I remember when I read The Boys in the Boat, and then the young readers adaptation, my kids read it, and I thought, gosh, if they would have always just made history more personal throughout the years, I think you wouldn't lose so many readers, you wouldn't lose so many students, you wouldn't lose so many readers of nonfiction so early on. So I think it's fascinating the way you do that. We have a comment, somebody said that Boys in the Boat was one of her all-time favorites, and she can't wait to read Facing the Mountain as well. And Yeah, so your works are so inspiring, and make you realize, gosh, like these people go through such horrific things, and there's so much we can learn from these different situations. Now, in reading Facing the Mountain, you said you went to that project in Seattle to start your research. Was there one particular, I mean, obviously as a nonfiction writer, you're interested in history and you're always reading. Was there one particular story that made you realize that, oh yes, this is going to be my next book?
Yeah, actually there is. There's about a 3-minute clip actually that really pushed me over the top in terms of deciding to do it. And I don't want to give away too much, but 3 of the 4 characters in the book joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was an all Japanese American unit that fought in Europe. And they fought a particularly brutal battle on the French-German border. And they took enormous casualties. And after that battle, they were asked to appear on a parade ground so that the general in charge could review them. And when they showed up on the battle for this review, there were so few of them standing, still able to stand, that the general got mad and started chewing out some of the officers. He wanted the entire unit to show up for this parade. And so few had turned up. So few had turned up because so few were still alive and uninjured. And so one of my characters, Rudy Tokiwa, is talking about this in an oral history that is at the Densho archives. And as he's telling us, he just completely falls apart. He's remembering that moment vividly, and he begins to tear up. And the moment I saw that clip, I was absolutely determined to tell the story. I'm not hearing you.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah.
That's the exact thing I was talking about when you read in your history books that there was a ceremony and you just read that, then that's it.
What? So what, right?
You lose the whole human element of it. And I just find that to be so compelling. Before I ask you any more questions, I just wanted to remind everybody that's in the chat that this is your forum. You can ask anything that you would like, and we will have Daniel answer with you for you. And would you like to tell us a little bit more about your partnership with Densho and how much that meant in the making of this book or any other works you have coming up?
Yeah, so the book really began with, I met this fellow named Tom Ikeda in Seattle. Tom has spent the last 25 years, as I say, collecting these oral histories. And I have worked from basically, well, shortly after I met him, I went home and I started looking at all these oral histories, and that's what got me interested. But once I decided I wanted to actually write this book, I've worked very closely with Tom to try to find a reasonably small number of characters that could carry the larger story. There's basically 4 principal characters. There are many other characters, of course, that come in along the way. But the arc of the story, I had to find 4 people whose stories intersected in particular times and places. So that was in order to tell the story. So that was a big challenge. And Tom was an enormous help with that. Tom and his historian, Brian Nia, both. And then Tom and his associates opened a lot of doors for me to members of the Japanese American community and to the family members of the guys I was writing about. So I spent a lot of time talking to sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of these 4 fellows. And so it's been a real collaboration with Densho all the way. They're now very involved in helping me get word of the book out, particularly within the Japanese American community. So we're gonna have a national book launch, a virtual book launch that Densho is hosting on May 11th, and then a series of events after that.
Oh, that's wonderful. And what about the family members that you worked with on this project? were they family members that were all part of the oral history already, or were a lot of the family members unaware of a lot of these stories?
They were generally aware of their father or grandfather's, role in the story, what he had done during the war, and for the families that had been incarcerated in the camps, of course, they knew about that part of it. But a lot of them, as I've passed copies of the book past them and gotten their feedback, a lot of them have said that they learned a lot about the larger context for what their father or grandfather was going through. And I should also say their grandmothers and mothers. Although the four principal characters are all male, this book is about these four families and the relationships and what the whole family's experienced during the war. So also a lot of them have in fact said that they learned things from the book about the context in which their family's experiences fit in.
I'm sure I really love the idea of that Densho project. I think, when did that start? How long has that been in operation, or do you know?
I don't know exactly, but it's something like 25 years. So, and Tom's built up a whole organization around it. So it's a vast archive. And it's, by the way, it's completely open and free to the public at densho.org, all the oral histories. And it no longer is just oral histories. He has collected thousands of photographs and diaries and documents, and all this has been, excuse me, reproduced digitally, deliberately to make it accessible to researchers like me, but also just to the general public. So people can go in and they can find these recorded interviews of the fellows I'm writing about. Actually, I've put on my website, danieljamesbrown.com, I've pulled out some of the clips and put them up there in an area called Beyond the Book, so that as people read the book or after they read it, they can go and quickly see some of the key moments in the interviews that helped inform the book.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to mention that later, because I think that's great that you did that. And also thank you for answering the question about the records being open in Seattle. And that was one of the questions in the Q&A. Another question that came up in the Q&A is, do you have any topics for future books you'd like to share? And what we're already moving you on to your next book.
Yeah, I mean, this one's not even published yet.
No. Do you find when you're doing research though that you are kind of like, oh, this is so interesting, I'll have to put this aside for a new book while you're in the middle of doing your research for something else?
I do sometimes. I note things down sometimes to go back and look. I mean, almost always they turn out not to be something I want to pursue. I mean, the thing is, it's a huge commitment to spend 4 or 5 years of your life with one story. And so you really have to fall in love with the story. You really have to want to spend that much time in whatever world it is that you're recreating. And so often what will seem like a really nice little nugget of a story, it is a nice little nugget, but it either peters out and doesn't really bloom into something rich enough to become a book, or it just becomes something that perhaps doesn't engage me. So I do keep looking. I'm always looking, but the finding is hard.
How long? Backing up one more time about the Boys in the Boat book. How long was it that you wanted to write that story? Being that was your next door neighbor, did you feel that you wanted to write it, or do you feel like it was so easily handed to you because it was your next door neighbor that you had no choice? Do you know what I mean?
The latter, basically. It was, I mean, I decided to write that book the day that I met Joe Rance. I mean, he was my neighbor for years before I knew who he was. And when I did meet him,
that's right. I remember that, you saying that. Yeah.
And when I did meet him, he was living under hospice care, and he was near the end of the road. So it was really his daughter Judy that she had spent years documenting her dad's life. So she had boxes of letters and photos and news clippings. And she had asked him questions for several years before he passed away. She'd been trying to document everything she could. So even after Joe passed away, I had Judy and I spent hundreds of hours together going over all that material. And that's really what made that book possible.
Oh, unbelievable story. And one of the reviews of Facing the Mountain talks about the spirited portrait of courage under fire, which is what I kind of thought The Boys in the Boat was about. So is that kind of what is the thing that you are drawn to? Do you think that's what it is that made you write this next book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always drawn to stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And that pretty much always involves some form of courage. I think in the case of this Facing the Mountain, that the courage part is going to be very obvious. So a good chunk of the book is about the experience in war of 3 of the 4 young men that I follow. The 4th young man, though, Gordon Hirabayashi, is sort of a counterweight to that. Gordon lived in Seattle. He was a University of Washington student. People in Seattle are generally acquainted with him, his story. He actually refused when people were rounded up to be put on buses to send to the camps. Gordon refused to get on the bus. Instead, he wrote a letter stating his opposition to the incarceration of people, and went downtown Seattle to the FBI office and turned himself in. And from that followed years of Gordon being in and out of jail, first in the King County Jail, then a prison camp in Arizona, and finally a federal prison in Washington State. But all this while fighting a legal battle against the incarcerations of the entire Japanese, Japanese American, Japanese population on the West Coast. So, but so he's not fighting on battlefields and demonstrating that kind of courage. I see it as sort of another face of courage. He chose to deal with the problem in a different way. The core of what interested me about this story was all these young Nisei 2nd generation draft age men at the beginning of the war, right after Pearl Harbor, had this mountain of problems they had to overcome. And they dealt with it in different ways. Some enlisted in the Army to demonstrate their loyalty. Some resisted service in the Army. And so I think taken as a whole, you get a picture of these young men dealing with a really difficult, complex situation in different ways, but to my mind, all in a very courageous way.
Oh, absolutely. We have a couple more questions, but I think we're a little bit out of time. Let me just see, how do you infuse personality into these characters, given that during the process of research, you can only find historical facts? I guess other than meeting the family members and stuff, if there's any other thing you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, well, basically that. I mean, talking to family members is the best way to get into the characters, who this person really is. I mean, listening to the oral histories, of course, helps. But when you talk to the daughter or the granddaughter or the son or grandson, they are able to tell you things about this character that may not appear in the book at all, incidents or whatever, but they do help develop a sense of who this person was and, his or her strengths, weaknesses, foibles, and so on and so forth. So talking to relatives is very helpful.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm sure. Well, I think that a book like this and reading about courage in all forms, under all sorts of pressures, is a great way for any reader to spend time during, especially right now. I feel like everybody's had their own issues with courage in one way or another in the past year. So the timeliness of this book is wonderful. The care you put into the research is very appreciated by those of us that love to read these kinds of books. And for those of us who are parents that like to hand over these stories to our younger children, I love that they're making these available for young audiences also. And we thank you so much for being here today, Daniel, and we wish you the best with this book, and we'll be talking about it. And any questions we didn't get a chance to answer, please email us at library@penguinrandomhouse.com, and we will get answers for you. So thank you. Thank you for the panel, and thank you for being here today.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.